My name is Patrick Monks. I'm with the Vermont DEC Stormwater Program. With me today is my coworker Kevin Burke, also with the Stormwater Program, and Teresa Thomas with the Water Investment Division. Got that right? Formerly part of the Facilities Engineering Division. This is the, thank you. This is the public meeting for draft Stormwater General Permit 3-9050. As mentioned, there's a sign-in sheet. If you'd like to receive notification of the final general permit when we issue it and our response to public comments, you will need to sign in. There's also a checkbox there for folks who want to provide public comment today. Public comment can be just verbally today, or it can be in writing. So just to cover the basic plan for this afternoon, I will provide a general overview of the general permit. Then we'll have time for question and answer. And then following that, we'll have a formal comment period. So in which case we'll check the sign-in list, see how many folks want to provide comment, and we'll reserve enough time right at the end for folks to do that. The hearing is recorded, so we can transcribe that. If anyone's interested in providing written comment today, I have some forms if that's convenient for you. We've got a couple extra pens, but most of the comment we receive comes in writing through the environmental notices bulletin. You can sign up online under the environmental notices bulletin to receive notification of all our permits, pretty much, but certainly this general permit. If you sign up under that, you'll receive notification of the final permit and the response summary when it comes out. If you're eventually interested in appealing the general permit, you do need to have provided comment. The meeting is scheduled to run until 3:30. And let's see. I think I mentioned the meeting will be recorded. The public comment period runs, we're currently in it right now, and it closes at the end of the day, November 8th. All comments that, for us to, if we want to consider them or able to consider them, they need to be received by the 8th. At the conclusion of that public comment period, we'll be issuing the final permit, final decision on the permit, along with a response to all comments received. I did include next to the sign-in sheet, and if we're running out, I can add more. There's just a basic one-pager that covers the process for the public comment process. It includes links where to get copies of the general permit, fact sheet, and other information on it. So I'll pause there for just a second. Any questions on the process?
Excuse me.
This afternoon? Yes.
To sign up now if we may have a question later.
Yes, but if that's just so we can have a sense. You can certainly, we can certainly add names as we go. So if you just want to sit through and get through the questions and answers, and if your stuff's answered, or if you get an idea for a comment, you want to sign in there to provide comment, we can do that later in the meeting as well.
Could you project your voice?
Sure.
More?
I'll do my best. Yes, it's okay, sure.
Thank you.
All right, anything else on process? All right, so the general permit itself, just a little bit of history on it. This goes back, the requirement for the general permit goes back to Act 64 of 2015. This is also known as the Vermont Clean Water Act. It included a lot of programs. They were primarily influenced by the need as part of the development of the Lake Champlain phosphorus TMDL. As part of that, we understood or learned that we needed to reduce phosphorus from a range of land use sectors, including farming, from rivers, from forests, and certainly from developed lands. That's where the stormwater piece fits in. As part of the development of the implementation plan for the TMDL, and the TMDL plan, the TMDL is essentially a phosphorus budget for the lake. That is how much phosphorus can the lake take in and still meet standards. So we understood that those phosphorus levels needed to be reduced. As part of that, our agency was required to develop an implementation plan that identifies all the requirements or all the programs we will put into place in order to achieve those phosphorus reductions. The legislature codified some of those requirements into statute, and among them was the requirement that we implement some new programs. You may have heard about the municipal roads general permit. That requires municipal roads to be maintained per certain standards. But it also required that we develop a new rule and general permit for what are called 3-acre sites. I'll get into the definition of 3-acre site in just a minute. So that's essentially, that statutory requirement is what's driving the adoption of the rule, which we adopted back in March, and this general permit. So this new general permit applies to all operational stormwater permitting. And by operational stormwater permitting, I mean discharges of stormwater from impervious surfaces. Impervious surfaces being hard surfaces, roofs, parking lots, roads, so forth. It combines 2 existing general permits. If you are a stormwater practitioner, an engineer, or whatever, you're familiar with General Permit 3-9015, which we currently use for permitting of new projects. And we have General Permit 3-9010, which we use for renewal of existing stormwater permits. Those are being combined into one general permit, so it's longer than the old general permits, but we do more with it. New projects, renewal of existing projects, 3-acre sites, those are all covered under this new general permit. We also cover discharges to impaired waters, stormwater impaired waters like Moonbrook here in Rutland. Previously, those projects needed to obtain individual permits, so there will be some administrative deficiencies in the new general permit. So going back to the stormwater rule that I mentioned, again, that was a statutory requirement. As part of that rule, we adopted standards for the 3-acre sites. So most of what is in the general permit is not new. The requirements exist, they exist in statute, they exist in rule. The general permit is the vehicle by which those projects will obtain permit coverage, including the 3-acre sites. As to what a 3-acre site is, statute and state law just said require permits for impervious surfaces of 3 or more acres. So as part of the rule, we define that. So an impervious surface of 3 or more acres is I'm going to paraphrase here, but it's in the general permit and it's in the rule. It's a single tract of land or a lot that has 3 or more acres of impervious surface that never had a permit, never had a stormwater permit, or if it had a stormwater permit, that permit was issued prior to 2002. In 2002, we adopted our stormwater management manual, so that's generally viewed as the more modern era of stormwater management, and the goal here was to retrofit projects that met standards in place before 2002. So in addition to a 3-acre site being any single lot with 3 or more acres of impervious surface, it includes multi-lot projects, a residential subdivision, a commercial or industrial park, where there was a permit in place for 3 or more acres. So in some of those subdivisions, no single lot may have more than 3 acres, but in some total they have more than 3 acres. But again, we only get into those subdivision situations if that subdivision previously had a permit. If you are in a residential subdivision built, say, in the 1960s or the 70s, never had a stormwater permit, if the sum total is over 3 acres, that doesn't matter. You're not captured by the 3-acre requirements. So again, I'm just giving I'm going to throw a lot at you perhaps. This is just the general overview. We can, in a minute I'll be done and we can get into sort of the question and answer phase of this. In terms of the technical standards for 3-acre sites, what do you have to do? If you are a 3-acre site, what does that mean? There's our technical standards that projects need to meet are included in what as mentioned in the Stormwater Management Manual. That's also adopted by rule. There's 5, 6 different standards that new projects need to meet. For a 3-acre site, you meet one of those standards. It's called the redevelopment standard, and it's focused on providing water quality treatment. So it acknowledges that providing stormwater treatment on an existing developed site is a lot different than providing treatment for a new project. Additionally, if you are in a stormwater impaired water, in the watershed of a stormwater impaired water, again, like Moonbrook and Rutland, there's the additional requirement to provide what's called channel protection, or meet the channel protection standard, which is a detention standard based on the 1-year storm to prevent the stream channels from unraveling. In the case of Moonbrook, the city is required to develop a restoration plan So bringing these 3-acre sites into conformance with channel protection will help Moonbrook meet standards. So pretty much all those items that I've mentioned have been already adopted in the rule. So it's essentially, those are existing definitions, existing technical standards, and so forth. Additionally, there are some new items in the general permit that were not included in the rule. That includes the schedule by which 3-acre sites need to apply by. There's different categories of projects: projects that never had a permit, projects that have a permit that's expired, projects that have a permit that will expire. The general permit identifies by when projects need to apply based on those categories, and also by where they are in which portion of the Lake Champlain watershed they are in. By law, we have to have all sites permitted by 2023. So it doesn't give us a lot of time. We've got roughly 700 projects to move through the permitting process. So when they passed the law, it seemed like that was a long ways out. As we approach 2020, we realized it's actually all fairly soon. So again, in terms of what's new in the general permit, it's the schedule. And also we developed technical standards for two categories of projects. And in the rule, we noted we would do this. So we have some ski areas and so forth have isolated areas of impervious surface. So yes, clearly Killington's a 3-acre site, right? But up on the side of the mountain, they may have a small building related, might be related to a ski lift or a pump house or what have you. So the general permit acknowledges that some small impervious surfaces are better managed through simplified treatment practices versus full compliance with the redevelopment standard. So what we've identified those areas, we call them isolated impervious surfaces and isolated roads. So for the isolated impervious surfaces, again, the small buildings that are not connected to other impervious surfaces, they essentially need to ensure that there's no significant erosion occurring around that structure. And then also for access roads that aren't part and parcel of adjoining development. So picture, again, using the ski area example we just drove over for on the way here. You might have a mountain access road. Those roads would meet the same standards that our municipalities meet under the municipal roads general permit. So stabilizing your ditches, stabilizing your culvert outfalls, keeping your road crown, those sorts of practices versus the practices that are in the stormwater management manual. So we can certainly, as part of the public comment process, folks are totally able to provide comments on those proposed technical standards, and they can be revised based on your input. For those of you who followed along with our process so far, you've probably seen that we have a list of 3-acre sites. Those are sites that we've preliminarily identified as falling into the category of a 3-acre site. We used our existing permit information where we had it, and then we also used essentially satellite imagery to map the impervious cover, overlaid that with parcel boundaries to identify where the 3-acre sites are. Certainly we've gotten questions from various folks as to whether they are or what they should do if they disagree or have questions as to whether or not they are a 3-acre site. We can have that conversation with folks at any time. You can apply for, or essentially ask for, a formal permit determination and to have our preliminary determination reconsidered. And certainly we expect that some number of projects will come off the list as you provide us better data. So that's pretty much what I have for the general overview of the general permit. I'm happy to take any questions you might have, and again, following that, if anyone wants to provide formal comment, we're set up to do that as well.
Hi, Representative Patty McCoy. Can you just give us a sense of the cost of this? You talk about fees. are they different for, say, a 5-acre parcel that you consider impervious as opposed to a parcel that is 12 acres? Does it go by acres? And what is like, is it a cost per acre? And what does the business person need to do? Hire an engineer? Who's going to approve that? What's the cost of an engineer? And what are the ongoing costs for the business person once they are in this program and they've done the first year? And what is the following year and the year after that ongoing?
Sure, thank you. The way the general process works is the landowner would hire an engineer to assist them with the application. I don't have those costs. There's a couple engineers in the room. If anyone wants to chime in, that's fine. But certainly it's significant. There are application review fees of $860 per acre of impervious surface. Projects, there's also included in the rule, and then as a result in the general permit, there are also stormwater impact fees. So the way it works is if a project can't meet standards, so folks can't choose not to meet standards. They have to go through a feasibility analysis to figure out the best level of treatment they can provide relative to the requirements. If there are site constraints that don't allow them to fully meet standards, then they potentially pay stormwater impact fees. Those stormwater impact fees work out to $12,500. It's listed as $25,000 per acre for the water quality treatment standard. But because 3-acre sites meet the redevelopment standard, which is half of that, for the water quality portion, it works out to $12,500 per acre. So if they did nothing on their site for treatment, they would pay that $12,500. If they, per acre of impervious surface, so to your question, does a 3-acre site pay less than a 5-acre site and so forth? Yes, those fees get higher the larger the impervious surface.
Is that per year?
That's a one-time fee. And then additionally, for projects in stormwater impaired waters that need to meet channel protection, that's a $25,000 per acre fee. There are ongoing operating fees for all stormwater permits of $160 per acre per year. Did I get all your questions?
Well, who decides whether the parcel can comply or not? The engineer that you hire or A&R?
Ultimately, A&R makes the decision as to whether or not the application is sufficient and whether we agree. But the applicant's engineer undertakes the feasibility analysis, submits it to us, and then we get to agreement, and that determines whether or not the project meets standards or whether they need to pay. The flip side of the impact fee system is that projects that exceed standards are able to be reimbursed at that same rate, the $25,000 per acre.
So you're saying basically if I have a 10-acre site of impervious soil, it could cost me up to $200,000?
All told? Sorry, just if we could, just for the record as we go, I guess it's less important for the question and answer process, but if you could state your name, that would be great.
Patrick, this is Jeff Lindberg, Oakland City Public Works. I'm not sure the last question was, for everybody here, was completely clearly answered. So I'll state it and then you correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
Okay. The first obligation is to do this feasibility analysis, this engineering analysis. The fees that could apply, depending on how that comes out, are not an option for the property owner. You're required to do as much, regardless of cost, to meet the standard as is feasible, as is technically possible. It can be engineered. And then if you fall short, regardless of the cost, then you pay the fees for whatever the equivalent acreage is that has not been treated. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So the fee isn't in lieu of fixing the problem. You have to fix the problem no matter what that costs. And then to the degree you can't, then you pay the fee for the portion that you can't. Do you have estimates on what typically a retrofit site might cost per acre based on projects that have been done around the state? I mean,
Yeah.
the actual construction cost, not the fees.
The fees range quite a bit based on the projects that, excuse me, that the department has funded. Years ago, we did some research as to what it costs to comply with the Stormwater Management Manual. We came up with $30,000 per acre, what it actually cost. This was going back 16 plus years. We updated that cost, and it's more along the lines of $50,000 per acre. That's for new. In some situations, retrofits will be less, and some will be more. It's very site specific, and I don't say that to try to dodge the fact that this is costly. But I think it's much more along the lines of 50,000 per acre, plus or minus quite a bit. I agree with what you said in the way you presented it. You do need to do as much as you can do regardless of cost, but there are feasibility criteria that speak indirectly to cost. You don't need to buy new land. You don't need to pump the stormwater and so forth. But it does, if you do, it does require you to consider, certain means, which can be quite expensive in a retrofit situation.
Patrick, I'm assuming that tearing up your parking lot and installing a system under the parking lot is something that is not something exempted by the feasibility study, and that if it's found to be feasible would be required?
That's correct. Under our feasibility criteria, temporarily removing impervious surface like a parking lot to put in an underground treatment structure is required to be considered. And we do have, the manual does allow for subsurface infiltration systems, so that's why it's required. There are criteria related to creating sort of a more permanent interference with the land use. You don't have to remove your driveway permanently to accommodate the treatment, but it does need to be considered.
But it could mean tearing up existing infrastructure in order to install something, just to put back down a parking lot surface or something.
Yes. One thing I didn't touch on is this, in addition on the schedule is, the dates I was focusing on the application dates. And that statute does require that we have everybody permitted by 2023. Projects would have a 5-year permit term to implement whatever design ultimately is approved as part of that project. And in the back row?
On that, it's going to go very well. But beyond that, just from a consumer's point of view, have you calculated two things? One, understanding that Lake Champlain is the problem, and that Otter Creek drains into Lake Champlain. As far as Rutland County goes, have you been able to understand how much we contribute to this big problem that we're going to have to live with?
Yes.
And not to Burlington and Winooski with their constant overflows because their systems aren't big enough.
Sure. The Lake Champlain TMDL broke down the phosphorus load by river basin, essentially, and by area. So I certainly don't know off the top of my head how much comes from Rutland or Rutland County, but that essentially was identified and determined during the TMDL process.
As I looked at, the second half of that question is, have you calculated what it's going to cost the people of Rutland County in order to continue to frequent these businesses who are going to have to raise all their prices in order to cover the expense of what we have not yet seen a good reason for as far as Rutland County dumping into Lake Champlain?
The cost we've developed implementation costs, estimates, what it will take, essentially basin-wide and statewide, ultimately. The 3-acre requirements, we're focused on the Lake Champlain Basin right now because Lake Champlain Basin has an earlier application date. The rest of the state has an application date of 2033, so the Connecticut Basin will be in as well. So we've developed general cost estimates or what the implementation will cost, not the more advanced cost.
Because it's a tax on the people living. Because if these businesses are able to stay in the state, then we're going to be paying the bill.
Understood.
So how much is it going to cost us? And how many businesses are going to close because of the expenses that you're going to...
There's questions I can answer today, and I'll do my best. I mean, some of these may be, maybe better suited for...
And I understand
for comment.
that you didn't think this up, the legislator thought this up. I'm not picking on you.
I don't mean, when I point out the fact that this is a statutory requirement passed by the legislature, I don't do that to pass the buck and say they made us do it. Certainly, the agency was tasked with how do we achieve these water quality goals? Those are legal requirements. They're not discretionary. So so our agency developed a proposed plan. The legislature made it a requirement. So I just don't want to, I don't want you to think, I don't mean.
trying to...
Sure, and I think, well, again, I don't know, a good time for you to jump in. Teresa is one of our finance experts. We had, the stormwater program developed some rough cost estimates for implementing the Act 64 requirements. We're into the hundreds of millions. I don't have them with me in front of me today.
Is it worth it?
Yeah, I mean, one, we have to do it. Two, I personally believe it's...
We have to do it because legislators said you have to do it. But the question is, I'm asking you, is this expenditure, what it's going to cost the people of the state, worth what you're going to accomplish?
I personally think so. We suffer economic harm today as a result of, the degraded condition of some of our receiving waters, including Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain is a truly important economic asset to the state. So I think just saying it's not worth it and letting it persist in a polluted, in a state that doesn't meet standards, that's costly as well.
So again, I'm Teresa Thomas. I'll just give a quick high-level plug on the financial piece. So it's very clear this is going to be a really expensive requirement, and I'll just give I manage all of the state's financing pieces, so Clean Water Initiative Program money, Lake Champlain Basin Program money, the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. So we have a bunch of different pots of money. And what I'm being tasked with now, along with the rule coming out, is working on the finance side to say, I'm not necessarily the regulatory person, but the money needs to be there where possible. And so trying to figure out where the money is going to come from in all of these sources, what percentage needs to be a cheap loan, what percentage needs to be grant, and how do we get all of these sources sort of duct taped together into a funding plan. So that's what I'm working on right now. And the price tag is pretty significant, and unlike the municipal borrowers that I work with a lot of the folks that are going to be required to go through this process and come up with the money, they're not necessarily, that's a big administrative task to go through that process. So we're really focused on how to get the money so that it's available. It's not going to be 100% free money, but to get as much free money or get as much cheaper loan money available as possible and get that to the folks that need it based on affordability needs and based on maybe early adoption. So this is working on the plan right now with internally within the agency, and we hope that sort of December, early January, once the permit actually takes effect, that we'll be able to reach out. So we're working on Green Schools initiative where we're trying to ramp up outreach for schools that are going to be required to comply under this, so public schools. And so that's just one little nugget in this. So there's all different kinds of entities that are going to have to comply with this. So really interested in hearing, throughout the public process and the follow-up comments, just getting an idea of sort of some of the barriers that are out there and sort of ideas on ways to make the money flow a little bit more easily. But that's just from a high level, just we're working on it and trying to build it up so that at the point when folks actually need to come in and actually get their permit, that there's some type of a funding package available, so it's not just sort of on your own.
Terry Williams from Colby. A couple comments. First of all, it's not free money because somebody's paying for it. Number one. Number two, you've got school systems that are going to have to come up with money. You're calling this a fee, but it's going to cause us to have our taxes raised for property taxes. And why, the question I've got is, why are we only trying to clean up Lake Champlain from one side? What's New York State doing? Why are we only making ourselves clean up one side of the lake? You can't clean it up from one side.
Right. What New York is, New York also has a TMDL, the total maximum daily load cleanup plan, and they have requirements as well. I can't speak to them in detail, but they aren't off the hook.
So have we tried to work with them?
Yes, and Vermont is the larger contributor of phosphorus to Lake Champlain, but New York does contribute.
They got as many farms over there as we do over here. They have more.
Yeah. The TMDL identifies the relative contribution of Vermont versus New York. That may be of interest to you, but the general understanding belief is that Vermont contributes significantly more. But with that said, they do have treatment plants, they do have farms, they do contribute, so they have requirements as well. Off the top of my head, I can't tell you what they are.
So that list of properties that got put out, is that an all-encompassing document? Is that all, how'd you come up with the plots that are actually polluted?
That's just Vermont.
Yeah, but I've noticed a few.
It's just based on the amount of impervious surface.
Yep. I've noticed a few places on it that aren't on there. That probably, did you take it with the aerial photographs? Did somebody physically go there?
We have, most of the towns now have, parcel data that they can share with us. And we also have, we contracted with folks who use satellite imagery to identify the impervious surface on the ground. So we get maps that show whether it's forested or lawn or impervious surface, and then that parcel map gets overlaid with that. So there may be some big projects that clearly look to be more than 3 acres, but they may have multiple parcels so that no single parcel is over 3, in which case they would not be in. With all that said, we can't guarantee 100% accuracy that we got everybody, or that everybody we got needs to be in.
So if people don't fuss up that they've got one, you're not going to have, some people are going to end up paying and others aren't.
Yeah, I think we've done a thorough job and a fairly accurate job in identifying those. I don't think there are many, but certainly there may be some. It could come up also just down the road as people transfer property. An astute buyer might say, hey, are we a 3-acre site? I want to find out before we commit to purchasing it. Some will be identified that way. But again, I don't expect it's going to be a large number.
I'm Brian Duffy with the Rutherford Development Authority. To that point, adding cost and expense to existing real estate and potentially hurting the businesses or property owners seems like a counter message to what I've heard from the administration, which is we're trying to make Vermont as business friendly as we can. We're trying to encourage new investment. Can you speak to what type of economic modeling or analysis went into this as it was being developed on the costs of either putting people out of business or potentially curtailing projects before they begin because of this additional new cost?
The cost estimation that we did for economic analysis, there's a minimal amount that's required as part of the rulemaking process, and then again we did do a fairly basic cost estimate as to what it'll cost, nothing beyond that. But I don't know about discouraging new development. New development is currently regulated. So, today a new project with 1 or more acres of impervious surface would require an operational permit. That threshold does get lowered to a ½ acre in 2022. So just to be clear, I'm happy to keep taking questions and I'll answer as many as I can. Actually, maybe if you want to grab the sign-in sheet. I don't know how many folks want to provide a formal comment. So this is still informal. Happy to keep going like this, but I do want to save some time to take any formal comments.
Can I just follow up on that with the question about the financing in place to assist? It sounds like the timeline that's in place, at least in the draft, is pretty aggressive within the impaired waterways, as in this spring. So when do you expect those monies, whatever they may be, to be available and spelled out as far as assistance? Will those pay for the preliminary feasibility study that these property owners are going to be tasked with in hiring their engineer?
Quick interjection on the schedule. The earliest project that needs to apply would be 12 months from the final issuance of the final permit. Projects would be granted automatic permit coverage if they expire during that time frame or they're currently expired, but still an aggressive schedule to your point.
Yeah, so in terms of when the funding will be available, there is the chance that the funding pot that we come up with will require some legislative and statute changes, just within the different funding programs that are available in the department. So it would likely be, we would like to have the plan in place January, February, but it might take some months. So I would say certainly prior to those 2020 applications, the actual funding should be in place. As far as what it will cover, I don't have the answer to that. So I don't know, for example, if it will cover all of planning and then some portion of implementation or construction or vice versa. So I don't have the answers to that yet.
Sorry, the back, you had your hand up.
Hi, me here. Gail Gillum, Clarendon. Is this the only public meeting there's going to be
We have public meetings
in Rutland County?
Yes.
Okay. Second question. Why would the meeting be at 2 p.m. in the afternoon when all the people are working that own the businesses?
We've had evening meetings and we have the same.
In Rutland? Is this the first meeting?
No, this is the first public meeting as part of this general permit. We have public meetings regarding other processes. They're typically held in the afternoon. Sometimes we hold them in the evening and we get similar feedback. It's sort of, there's always some portion of the population for whom it's difficult to make.
Most people that own businesses are working.
Understood?
Okay. Number 3, how is this publicized, this meeting?
It's publicized in newspaper
It was?
and environmental notices bulletin.
Okay. It was in the Rutland Herald?
I believe so. It's published in all the newspapers, records across the state.
And my final question, is this just for businesses or is this for homeowners also?
The 3-acre sites do include residential projects, commercial, industrial, all land use types. Sorry?
What is that? Because I just see businesses on the list.
It's all the same date. We have 3-acre sites that are residential. Off the top of my head.
Is that another list, a residential list?
No, it's all the same list.
Okay.
There may not be many in this area.
I have one more question. Why is this not starting up north, where most of the pollution is, instead of starting down here in Rutland? That's my question.
The earliest application, first folks apply are in the north, in Missisquoi. So we are starting north. We just happen to be having our first public meeting here. It's Montpelier tomorrow, Milton on Thursday.
I thought you said earlier that it's starting here and then moving up north.
No, it's moving east. It's moving east. The Champlain Basin, essentially the western half of the state, and Lake Memphremagog all have a 2023 date by statute. The Connecticut Basin and the southwestern portion of the state have a 2033 date.
Okay, thank you.
So Matt Brown at Brown's Auto Salvage in Castleton. So we already have 2 different stormwater permits. One is for our industrial activity and the other one is for our actual location. How does this interact with those permits, if at all? Like, does this require like more, does this give you like more restrictions? It seems like it's kind of like the same exact thing, but just a different name and a different fee structure. Does it actually change what activities are permitted and not permitted?
It won't affect your existing coverage under the multi-sector general permit for industrial. And you mentioned another permit for your facility, assuming that's an operational stormwater permit. If you've got 2 stormwater permits, that's what the second one likely is. This ultimately will replace your existing operational stormwater permit. So if you've got
Be permitted 3 times? Or
no. So when your existing operational permit expires, every permit usually has a 5-year term. Some of the older ones went 10 years. We can't do that anymore. So when that permit expires, you will reapply under this general permit.
Okay, so it wouldn't be doubled up then?
No, this won't be tripled up.
tripled up, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
You ever have?
Yes, just a procedural thing. I'm not sure I understand. My name is Richard Hill, and we're a slate quarry over in Poultney. We're on that sheet that was passed around. We have about 10 acres, although there were some obvious mistakes in the names and so forth. But what we have to apply for a permit by what? January 1st, 22, or is it 23?
I'd have to double check the schedules in the general permit as to your, where in the watershed you are. But yes, but continue.
Okay, so it's either 22 or 23. We hire an engineer, they go out, they do a survey, they say there's certain things that can be done to improve the situation, but it may not completely abate it. You know, it's maybe, and you got to remember, our roads are long in the woods, not very often traveled. I don't know of any phosphorus that we use in anywhere in our production process. So at that point, then the engineer comes back and says, okay, it's going to cost you $100,000 to do this, and still it's not going to completely solve the problem. Are we still liable for the $25,000 an acre?
You'd only be paying the maximum impact fee if you did nothing on your site. So it's reduced to the extent that treatment is provided.
Okay.
So, you know, if you manage, take a simple example, it's a parking lot, and the treatment standards would require that you manage it to a certain volume of stormwater. If you can get half of that, then your fee is cut by 50%.
All right.
Again, but if you meet the standard or go above, then, well, either you're paying no fees or you're potentially eligible to receive impact fees for exceeding the standard. The impact fees don't apply on those isolated roads. You know, if you said if you had an access road that's just going through the woods, those that are required to meet the road standards are exempt from the impact fees. And as to the date, well, 2023 is the date by which projects need to be permitted, so the last applications are due in early 2022.
And my last portion of this is we get, say we have the engineer come out and says it's going to cost you $100,000 to do this, and we say we can't afford to do that. So what do we do then?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, and I don't say that to be flippant by in any sense. You know, we've been upfront that this is costly. You know, with anyone who would listen. You know, we participate in the treasurer's report as to what's this all going to cost. And, you know, our program gets tasked with develop the standards, implement them. We understand it's going to be costly. And I understand that there are projects where that debt, that liability might be more than the property's worth, which is a horrible prospect. You know, as Teresa described, we do take that seriously. We are doing everything we can to come up with funding plans that'll help projects like that. But I'll leave it at that.
So if we just walk off and leave them and let the trees come up and so forth, are we still liable for that $25,000 an acre? I mean, we have 70 employees. If we have to let all our employees go and just let the thing grow up in the woods, we don't want to do that. But you may be putting us in a situation where we have to. So then what happens then? Are we still stuck for $25,000 an acre simply because we couldn't afford to do it?
We don't have the ability to not enforce, to not require the permit. So what happens when someone doesn't apply or can't afford to apply? I don't know. I think we have to do everything we can to prevent that and to assist folks who need it. All right.
Steve Terry.
Sorry if I've ignored that side of the room.
Is it possible for somebody to have 50 or 100 acres of impervious soil?
I'm not aware of any projects of that.
What's the large?
Like V-Trans, obviously for all state highways, they're regulated under a separate program. I'm not sure what if you group off the top of your head, I mean, once you start getting over 10, that's pretty big. Like the airports are pretty big.
The Army National Guard range in Jericho, I think, has quite a high total.
He said the Army National Guard facility in Jericho is one of the larger ones, but there are not many or any in that size. Sorry, and Okay, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, Senator Brian Collimer from Rutland County. I don't mean to minimize the financial aspect of this, and I think if anyone is in the room and hasn't taken the temperature of the room yet, it should be fairly clear to you folks as representing the agency that there's some serious, serious concerns here in terms of financial issues. But I want to address another one. I understand that July 1st, 2020 is the date by which, if you are in the Moonbrook watershed, which is impaired, you have to have your application in. Do you know whether there are enough engineers to do the work by that date?
I don't know, I suspect there are not.
So what are we going to do then?
Well, that date was originally drafted assuming we would have the general permit out earlier, so we can add time there. That would be an important point to provide comment on. We were, as part of our outreach, we're developing a list of at least the engineers who have done work with us in the past can be identified. So, if you're just a business, a landowner, and you get this requirement, where do you start? But there may not be a sufficient number of engineers to keep up with demand. We'll have to go from there. We can certainly, we have, enforcement discretion. So if someone said, hey, look, I will get my application in, I've tried finding an engineer, the earliest they can get to me is this date, we can generally work with people along those lines. And hopefully our engineering community can, obviously also, staff up to some degree if that turns out to be warranted.
I would suggest there's another way to do it, and the legislators here will perhaps take an interest in this, whether it's through LCAR, the Administrative Rules Committee, or changing the statute. I think there's enough pushback here that we need to take a look at this.
Yeah, I'm Jim Harrison. I'm a state representative, and for the record, some of us weren't there in 2015, so no credit for the law that you're having to work with. But I wanted to follow up. Nicole asked a question earlier, and I think you responded, whatever technically is feasible. And it sort of brought me back to when I was building my house. We have kind of a slopey land, hillside, and I remember a discussion with the excavator saying, well, you can put your house anywhere you want. There's a cost. So we end up with a compromise in putting the house where it didn't break the bank. But it sounded like, from what you answered to, if it means you got to tear up the whole parking lot and put in this new underground system, so be it. Doesn't matter if it costs $1 million. That's just the way it is. So if that's the case, is 2023 a drop dead date that these improvements have to be done? Or is there the ability to spread these out 20 years or whatever it is when you're talking major costs?
2023 is the date by which we have to have all the sites under a permit. Projects would have 5 years to implement. We don't have the ability to grant a 20-year time frame to go beyond the 5-year permit term in terms of, in terms of the time frame by which these projects would get constructed. And I think I would call it legally uncertain whether we can do it, and it's certainly complicated for a given project to come in and make that finding that they have to enter under some sort of what we call a compliance schedule. It's possible, but it's not clear cut that projects could get more than 5 years. Our plan at this point, and what we've put in the rule, is that projects would have 5 years.
5 years from the 2023?
That's the latest. Some sites will be permitted earlier than 23.
Obviously,
yes. So if
you're in
if you get
Rutland, it's 2020, I guess.
No, it'll be later. But yeah, so then you'll get 5 years from the time you get your permit. So you apply, take some amount of time to get your permit, but then once that's issued, be it in 2020, 2021, 2022, so forth, you get 5 years from then. Understanding that we certainly acknowledge that that's going to feel aggressive for a lot of projects.
Three things. Christopher Loris, Foley Distributing in Rutland, Vermont. Would you like me to put the three things in the form of a statement for the record, or do you want a question? I know it's 255, and I can do it however you
Yeah,
wish.
I mean, I think, how many folks wanted to provide a comment? Have you seen the list? Just a show of hands, anyone wants to provide verbal comment this afternoon? 3, 4. All right, we can take a couple more questions, and then, or I guess if that's any more questions before we get into statements, does that work for you?
Yeah, sure. As long as I can get a statement in.
Yes, thank you, John Clark, Brookfield. And I don't envy your job. You're doing a good job, and I wouldn't want it. Forgive me, I was a little late getting here. You mentioned that you have done a cost analysis of the implementation costs, did you allude to?
Yes.
And has that already been announced? Do we know what that is?
I didn't announce, and then I'm only hesitating because we broke it out by different categories. So in terms of the 3-acre portion, I don't know if you recall, T, but it's in the ballpark of 300 million.
And then there was suggestion that some of that, there may be some funding either for the planning or the implementation. And you suggested there's a legalistic cloud here. It's called the Constitution and Taking Clause. But my question would be that, I think that's what you're alluding to, because I think that's what people are talking about. If the costs of compliance exceed the value of the land, that's a problem. But my question is, the comments being taken today, if there are 450 people here who commented all negative, would it change the outcome whatsoever of what is being done?
It's a really, it really depends on what those comments are. If we got something wrong, we have, again, a statutory directive to do this. If we don't do it, there are significant implications. That's for all of us. If we got something wrong, like, hey, well, why don't you use a different technical standard? Or if you misinterpreted this, why don't you go this way? Well, of course. But if it's just, we don't want you to do this, that doesn't allow us to not do it.
And so if we were to have comments that said it was not constitutional and you're not allowed to do it, because then that wouldn't count?
Well, certainly, no. I mean, if someone's challenging the legality of what we're proposing to do, certainly that would be considered. And if we agreed, then we wouldn't do it.
And again, respecting you're the messengers, I'm not here to shoot anyone.
No offense.
But I think you gather that there is an imbalance between what might be a legitimate goal and the actual cause. And then actually, can people just buy like 1,000 acres of woodlands and buy the carbon sequestration and just offset it against their drainage? Like we're doing with California? Don't answer that.
Well, there's the ability to do lots.
The point is we can't buy
you can
our way
offset
out
your
of it.
impact fees, but no, not with carbon.
I hope you know I was a jest. So thank you for indulging.
Pleasure.
My name is Tom Terenzini. I'm the state representative for Rutland Town. And people in this room need to realize what goes on in Montpelier during the legislative session. It's all about green energy and the climate change. And I want to apologize to the people of the state of Vermont because it's my committee that has burdened you now with this 3-acre. And it's the state is made up of a bunch of cuckoo birds that fly low under the Golden Dome for 5 months up there. They're basically out-of-state wealthy legislators who made their money down country, and they use Vermont now as their little playground to impose rigid environmental laws against you now. And my committee is Fish, Wildlife, and Natural Resources. And we have several radical environmentalists on my committee. The Agency of Natural Resources is made up of several radical environmentalists. So what needs to happen here is people need to vote Republican and put business people back into office that know what a dollar costs and how much money Vermonters can pay in the way of taxes. We're not a rich state, we're a poor state. Rutland County is a blue-collar worker state. We don't have a lot of millionaires here. What company in their right mind would want to come to Vermont to deal with the environmental laws that impact all of us? Energizer down in Bennington, 100 jobs lost this week. They're pulling out. they're moving to Wisconsin. So, Patrick comes to my committee all the time. I like the guy, he's a great guy, but I don't like his agency, so, thank you.
Thank you.
Michael Shaw, State Representative. I'm looking at the draft list of the sites that are potentially going to be subject to their 3-acre requirements. When does that draft list become an end list? And then do you contact the landowners at that point, telling them of the deficiencies on their property? That's my first question.
Sure. Calling a draft kind of a misnomer. Really, we think those are 3-acre sites. So it never becomes final, so to speak, but those property owners will be notified from us. So once the general permit is finalized and as projects get closer to their application date, they will hear from us that says, we believe you're a 3-acre site, we believe you need permit coverage. Again, if a given site disagrees, there's a process for us to look at it.
Sure.
And
so with the timeline shortening all the time, we're going to bump up against 2020 fairly quickly as you go through this process here. So if I was a property owner, and I will ask my constituents to ask you, every one of them, to review the requirements that they need, and do they really need a permit? And with that being said, you said earlier that staffing is going to drive the bus about how fast you can get this out. Should you be inundated with requests for review, will that affect the timeline?
we always have to take into consideration our ability to keep up with workflow and what we demand of the public, I think is all I can say to that.
I guess the answer to that one is no. You won't be able to keep up with
I don't know. There's a lot of work coming. I know we'll be busy. Exactly how busy, I don't know right now.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Another. Nicole.
Hi, Nicole Kesselring with Edmund Kesselring Engineers. I think the temperature of the community here is that they're very, very concerned about the cost implications, and I know that's been heard already. But one of the things that I've felt kind of hasn't really come to the surface is that even if someone can implement, or this is what I'm hearing, even if someone can implement some stormwater measures which has a cost associated with it, they could still be subject to impact fees on their property. And a concern that we have as engineers is these are all going to be retrofits to existing properties, some that are paved edge to edge, which means tearing up, someone's parking lot in order to implement something. And in some cases, retrofits are just going to be challenging or limited in terms of what someone can actually accomplish. And it sounds like money could be available to people that are going to meet a certain percentage of treatment, but what's available for those property owners that can't meet that percentage of treatment? And my last point is, we're very familiar with the water supply funding program, and this needs to be much simpler. If business owners are going to be expected, who are trying to run their businesses, to apply for an application or apply for monies to either do design, feasibility, or implementation, it needs to be a really simple, streamlined process for them, because the water fund, the potable water funding is anything but that.
Maybe we could just pause here to take any formal comments, and if there's time after that, I just want to make sure we can get anyone on the record who wants to be on the record, and then I'm happy to come back to taking any more questions. So we're just going to use the list here and take folks in the order in which they...
About 6.
Okay. Apologies if I get anyone's name wrong. Patrick Griffin?
It'll be the next one.
Okay.
All right.
Nicole? What did you say?
I don't have anything else right now, but I might.
Okay.
Chris? Yeah, Christopher Loris, Foley Distributing in Rutland. Comment would be that the state should, or the agency rather, before it finalizes the permit, should strongly consider kicking the requirement for those properties within the city that are in the Moonbrook watershed to an appropriate time frame due to the fact that the city and the state have a settled agreement that the TMDL for Moonbrook, which, if you talk about surrogates, relates to the phosphorus for Lake Champlain, until the TMDL for Moonbrook is formalized, because the state and the city have a formal agreement stamped by a judge, providing that those properties within the Moonbrook watershed within the city don't need to retrofit until certain considerations are met with respect to Moonbrook's on-stream impoundments. So I think it would be folly to require those properties within the city to start an application and permitting process, which could be for naught once Moonbrook is fully mitigated, or the challenges of Moonbrook fully mitigated in water quality. That's one. Second one, and I did not speak to Representative Shaw or Senator Collmore on this one. I had it written down before they started speaking. But I will say that I'm less concerned, frankly, with the capacity of engineers, both within and without the state, to get the job done. That is going to be a challenge. I'm more concerned, frankly, and I think all of us should be more concerned with the agency's capacity to provide permit review for all of the projects that are coming down the pike. Specifically, if we have the NOIs due in 2020, July 1st, 2020, and a short 18 months period, 18 months later, all the other 3-acre properties are going to have their NOIs in. And there should be some analysis done by the agency with respect to you and staff's capacity to review all the permits that you know are coming. And if you are not going to be able to address those permits that come in on January 1st, 2022, because you're backlogged or have a log jam associated with the projects within the impaired watersheds, we should kick that down the road sooner rather than later. And I see no reason why the agency should not be able to do an analysis. You've got all the data in the world, how long it takes internally to manage projects, to permit projects. And if you know how many projects there are associated with impaired waters, you should be able to know how long it's going to take you to get those through your own systems, processes, and appeals, and adjust for the other non-impaired watershed properties later on. Number 3, and I don't know if this is I'll try to form the statement, but it's more of a question. However, I would hope that the residual designation authority requirements of Judge Durkin's 08 decision that the property owners will be absolved of any RDA requirements imposed by the state as a result of Durkin's decision in 08 if they begin to comply, because it would be improper for any property owner to start the application process to include possibly retrofitting and finding they aren't fully compliant, only to have the state or CLF roll in and exercise residual designation authority on those property owners who've already begun to mitigate for stormwater in the Lake Champlain TMDL.
Thank you. Oh, that's good. Yeah, okay. Another Chris. I don't know, Chris Howland still has?
No comment.
No comment. Robert Atkinson?
No comment this time.
John Clark?
Here again. Yes, I would just add for the record that if in fact it costs $300 million for business owners to comply, and you procure the money, we have no cause to complain. If the state falls short by $1, that's an unjust taking under the Constitution, and the Constitution does apply. People here have spent decades putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into a property with certain expectations, and now the whole game's being changed on them retroactively. And that's why we have a Constitution. So, I mean, I'm not purporting to be an expert either on this legislation or the dollars or the Constitution on the issue, but that's a fundamental issue, and it starts and ends with the Constitution. So if you guys go get the money from the rest of the taxpayers to impose on these business owners, then everyone can comply. And then the cost-benefit analysis will be more openly discussed rather than put on just a small groups of people's backs. But we have to have a reality between the income and the desired outcome. And that's just, you know, my take as an attorney on the U.S. Constitution. I don't understand, and it may be not your bailiwick. But it will be an issue, I think, for everyone.
Absolutely.
You know, we want a cleaner environment, but people need to run their businesses and pay for their homes. Thank you.
Last one, John DeBruin.
Yeah, John DeBruin from David. I have one question. I viewed your list of all the businesses affected in Rutland County. The one item I did not see in there were the solar farms. Why was this not addressed? They are a private entity.
Correct. Under our rules, we look at the ground surface and so a solar panel isn't necessarily impervious. It's just the base. It's just it's whatever base or whatever they have underneath the panel itself.
But you are...
Sorry, we're still taking, sorry, I answered the question, but during this part, we're just taking the comment in. The response to comments will come, you know, with the final decision. I just wanted to make sure we got all the on-the-record comments squared away. Sorry, do you want to add a comment for the record?
Yeah, I didn't see the list, so.
No problem.
I have a couple. First of all, again, this is Jeff Lindbergh, Public Works, Rutland City. I know we get beat up a bit on this whole combined sewers thing. We love our combined sewers, we just hate the overflows. If your property is in the colored areas, I'll leave this, is in the colored areas on this map in the city, you're exempt from this because your property discharges to combined sewers. Okay? I think that's correct.
Yes.
I've already asked you that before.
It's a comment.
So combined sewers actually are regulated through the wastewater treatment plant permit. So you can have more than 3 acres of impervious surface. But if it goes to the combined sewer areas, which are the ones on this map that are in color, which in the city is a pretty good chunk of the developed part of the city, you don't have to worry about this. It's being taken care of through the wastewater treatment plant permit and the issues that we're facing there. That's one of the reasons, we have several very good ones, but that's one of the reasons why the city has taken the position to try to preserve and protect combined sewers rather than to eliminate them, which has been the push for 20 years now. The second thing I'd like to offer is that what seems to be lacking, and I know that this is not within the purview of the agency, this is a legislative issue, but what seems to be lacking in this whole analysis and the program that you're tasked to bring out is anything close to an economic feasibility analysis on a site-by-site basis. Now, I'm not entirely sure how you would do that. I'm not an economist, but the notion that if it's technically feasible, if an engineer says, yeah, I know it's going to cost more than the property's worth, but you can rip up a parking lot and you can put this very expensive gizmo underground. You know, we can do all that stuff. Technically, we can do it, and then that gets you either to meeting the standard or close enough to meeting the standard that then you can pay fees and get there the rest of the way. That there needs to be some kind of a filter. There is in a lot of environmental programs. There are a lot of programs that we deal with at the municipal level that are considered also from a standpoint of what's affordable. Not just what's possible, but what's affordable. And the EPA has developed procedures and processes and methodologies for defining what's affordable and then adjusting the requirements, either in terms of schedule or otherwise, to live within that affordability criteria. That doesn't apply here, and to me, that's, if anything, is probably more important in a private sector application of a regulation than perhaps even the public sector in a municipal application. Finally, the last thing I'd like to offer, and I know that that's not something, that's a legislative issue, but finally, and I know we've had conversations about this, Teresa, you and I, a number of times. I would encourage you, when you look at the financing in particular, to look for opportunities, and I know you are, to work with municipalities. Part of the problem that Teresa and the agency is facing here is that the sources of the money carry lots of onerous requirements with them, especially if it's federal money that's sourced, and they get a lot of federal money that could be used to help under certain pots could be used to help. But the requirements that we have to jump through all the time when we borrow from the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to do wastewater treatment plant work or sewer lines or whatever are very complex and onerous. We're used to it. It's part of the process, and we're usually borrowing, I don't know, $3 to $10 million at a time, and you can go through a lot of hoops and hurdles for $10 million. Albeit we're paying most of it back, but there are also a lot of subsidies. If there's a way, and I know I've said this, but I'm saying it for the record here, if there's a way to work with municipalities to relieve some of that administrative burden on the part of the property owners, something like a local revolving fund or something like that that could be funded by the state, managed with state oversight locally, and provide or some at least, of the funds necessary for the private sector to do what they need to do, and at the same time either shift or reduce, I would say eliminate, but I guess that's probably not realistic, shift or reduce the administrative burden that a lot of these funding sources, that most private businesses would take one look at it and say, never mind. If you could do that so that the municipality deals with what we're used to dealing with, you guys get what you have to do under federal and state law, and the business owners get some relief, administrative relief, and hopefully also financial relief. I think that's a role that at least that my community would be happy to play if there's a way to do it. So those are the three things. Work with communities, see what we can do to help you solve some of these problems, and if there's any way to get a economic feasibility filter on some of these requirements, I think that would be a necessary thing in order to make this successful. Boarding up marginal or old, large commercial properties or industrial properties and telling tenants they have to leave and then turning the deed over to the state or whoever is not going to solve the environmental problems. And it's not going to help the economy, it's not going to help the community. We need an economic filter on this thing so that that is not an acceptable outcome.
Thank you. That's everyone we have signed up for providing formal comment on the record. With any additions?
I'd like to make one more comment. Nicole Kesselring and Kesselring Engineers. One thing I haven't seen mentioned is kind of a clear-cut date for when a subdivision could be subject to or not subject to the regulation. I know you've said if a subdivision was previously permitted. In looking at the rule, I was kind of expecting to see something like if a subdivision was formed before a date. I don't know if that's the way to address it, but I just feel like there's a lot of question related to subdivisions that I still have, whether a residential subdivision could be in or out, or, you know, things are apt to continue to change within subdivisions, and then could that somehow require a permit in the future? I mean, I don't know if assigning a date with subdivision would help clarify any of that or not. Such as if a subdivision was in existence before 2002 or something like that.
Any other comments for the record?
Lynn Edmonds from Wallingford. I just have one question. It seems to me that everything I've heard today revolves around Lake Champlain. So I would take it that that is how we would measure the necessity to do this extreme 3-acre rule. So I would be curious or interested to know, going back, how many years have we tracked the water quality in Lake Champlain? Where is it today as opposed to where was it 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? And what prompted this crisis that we would enact this law in 2015 to such an extreme extent to where we're at right now? It just seems to me that I haven't heard any discussion of the quality of Lake Champlain and how it's being monitored and where it's at and why we should do this. We're totally ignoring that, and that seems to me to be the measure that we should be looking at.
Okay, any other formal comments for the record?
Dolores Lopke, West Pollitt. In listening to the presentation today, I wondered about why these small parcels are being taken into consideration and small businesses are being targeted, when it seems to me the big crisis that occurred last year with Burlington City and the septic going into the lake, etc., how does it benefit the state to shut down our small businesses with such burdens? And how does it benefit the citizens of this state who would like to live and work here? My comment is, where is the common sense that should be making the state of Vermont run like a business instead of a political entity that is out of control? Thank you.
Yes, hi. David Sulia from Pittsford. I was just kind of curious. I got here just a little bit late. But since we're trying to, this is about clean waters and ultimately Lake Champlain, are you folks working with your counterparts over in New York State along that side in unison to help work, maintain getting clean water, watersheds flowing into Champlain? Or is this just a Vermont effort?
Sorry, we tried to run with a little bit of question and answer for a while, and then we're sort of in the formal comment portion right now, but just simply to answer your question, yes, we are working with New York. Anyone else for the record? Okay, we do have, was a comment or a question?
Just a comment.
Sure.
As far as I know, I believe the solar panels are an impervious surface. Just saying. And they're on roofs too. That's my comment.
Yeah, that's of course. It's not a good concept.
Okay. Well, appreciate all the input. We expected it would be significant and well-informed, and it certainly is.
Can you give us a definition of what an impervious surface actually is?
Sure. Impervious surface is defined as a man-made surface that water runs off of rather than through.
Okay, so we're the Port business. We have a lot of roads that are all they're just our gravel roads built on our slag piles. Would they be considered impervious?
Gravel road is an impervious surface.
It's not really gravel. It's just basically the slag pile that's being crushed up.
Yeah. Sometimes it does require a project-specific determination. So if you're, if you want to have somebody out there to, we can work with you, work with your engineer to define it. Certainly the working face or surface of a gravel pit or a quarry can certainly present a unique set of circumstances that need to be taken into consideration, especially because they're moving all the time and sometimes they're often self-contained and so forth. So just to be clear, taking questions, we've received all the formal comment?
Yeah, Chris Halvin, Rutland Town. I guess the first project I ever put my engineering stamp on in relation to water runoff was about 1986 or 87. So it's something I followed over my career. And as I drive by it in later years, I see the retention pond filled in and made a parking lot. The assumptions that I made in completing this project and meeting the requirements, the runoff didn't come to fruition. The volume of the pond was obviously filled in and made a parking lot. I haven't done a lot of them since then, but I think that some of the assumptions we make, for instance, you define a gravel road as impervious, and depending on the rainfall, it may not be. And that's the direction I think we need to re-examine some of the criteria which we apply to land surfaces.
Sorry, in the back.
Is clay considered to be impervious? So in which case you got the whole darn town of Wells is impervious.
Right. Right. Is that a comment or a question?
Well, that's a question.
No. The impervious surface is a man-made surface.
Oh, it has to be man-made, even though water doesn't go through it, it has to be man-made.
All right.
Even though water sits on top, it won't go through it, it has to be man-made?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure.
I just have a question. Has there been any consideration given to allowing property owners to sample what's coming off of their property before having to go through a design phase to see if they even have phosphorus runoff that would be contributing to problems?
No, in short, but we collectively, state, the agency, and pretty much every jurisdiction has followed a more best management practice approach, understanding that basically all stormwater is going to have phosphorus in it. Certain land uses have more than others. And so we've adopted best management practices, rain gardens, infiltration basins, retention ponds that are known to remove phosphorus to avoid having to go through project by project, having folks sample the water coming off, and then also proving compliance over time through sampling, like you would for wastewater. That's a much more costly endeavor than using the best management practice approach. Informs our approach.
Just a question about funding. Patrick Griffin from Edmund Kesselring Engineers. When I read the draft permit regarding funding, it seemed to, correct me if I'm wrong, that it seemed to say that you had no ability to apply for funds until after design, permitting, and construction was complete. Is that correct? And if so, is there a way to facilitate it so you can get funds before you do any of that?
I'm not sure what part of,
The general permit doesn't get into that. So that must have been some of the outreach materials. There's been outreach materials going out regarding the Green Schools Initiative and some other efforts. I'm not quite sure what you're focusing on there.
Do you have it in front of you?
Yep.
I think it's under 4.3, subsection B, number 2.
Oh, okay. You're not talking. Sorry, what page is that on yours?
I don't have it in front of me.
4.3. Are you looking at the rule or the general permit?
The general permit.
Okay. Oh, it's the fact sheet. Sorry. No, I'm looking at the fact sheet. My mistake.
Page 22.
that's also a thing. Public meeting copy, thank you.
It basically says, projects eligible for receipt of stormwater impact fees.
Okay, so that's not financing.
Okay.
So basically, yeah, there's a distinction there. So, again, a project that exceeds standards is able to receive stormwater impact fees, saying, all right, the standard was 50% of the water quality line. I provided 75%, or I treated. You can receive some amount of impact fees. You're able to apply for those fees once you've completed the project. So no, you can't get them before. That's not funding per se, that's an impact fee for which the project is entitled to receive.
So it's sort of a credit bank. So when somebody can't treat on their given property, then they pay in to those fees so that when folks overtreat, they can then get credit for that overtreatment.
So when we talk about providing funding or financing, that's separate.
So can you get financing plus these credits?
Yeah.
That's a detail to work out.
That's a little bit of a detail to work out, but yeah, it might be, we might have to think that all the way through in terms of grant funding. So like if we give somebody a grant for $50,000 and it overtreats, would we also then give them sort of offset money? So we need to think through sort of the logistics of that, but there's nothing like, especially financing, if there's a loan involved, there's nothing that would rule them out of receiving those.
Did I hear earlier in the presentation you said there was an $860 per acre application fee that's associated with this?
Yes.
That seems excessive and punitive for someone to be tasked with a retroactive permit and then assess that type of cost along with the engineering fees that are going to have to go into that permit. Would you agree?
Yeah, our fees are established in
Statute, and that fee was really informed by projects applying for new development applying for permits. It didn't have that lens of a retrofit site, someone who wasn't doing anything in mind. So your point, it currently does apply. We don't have the ability to waive it.
So how would that get reversed there?
That would have to get reversed by the legislature.
And where would that fund, where does that money go, that fee? Is that just fund your department's?
Generally speaking, yes.
Casper Wayne, dairy farmer, road commissioner, town of Clarendon. I'm seeing more and more wetlands created, and with the decomposing of the wood and everything, increasing the nitrate levels, increasing the phosphorus levels. I just don't understand, it's a comment, it's probably a loaded question. Why are we buying more land to reserve as wetland in that aspect and feeding that into our Lake Champlain Basin? And the second thing is, born and brought up on the creek in North Clarendon, and Jeff can attest to this, Mr. Winberg, about the capacity of our, not only Rutland's municipality sewage plant, but other plants in the state. When I was a little bit involved in the Rutland plant when it was built, the day it opened, it was under capacity. And it's not but grown as far as the volume going, production going into it. Why isn't we focusing on our main problems? And laying that back to myself as being a dairy farmer, through the FDA, they trickled us picked on us little dairy farmers to do all these little projects on the fencing to keep the cows away from the rivers and streams and stuff. Instead of that, should pool the money to fix the big problems. I'm not pointing to Mr. Winberg, but handle the big problems that's creating this, like the municipalities and stuff like that. And also your wetlands that's being created, that's developing, generating the nitrate levels and the phosphorus, higher phosphorus from the decay of the product that's in there from the logs and wood and stuff.
Yeah, every time I give a presentation on stormwater, actually it's the first time someone didn't say, what are the farmers doing? But we certainly get that question. We also get, what about the wastewater treatment plants? I don't have the Champlain TMDL in front of me, but the contribution of phosphorus from wastewater treatment plants is actually quite small, including those overflow events. They get a lot of press because they're gross and they affect the water and your ability to swim in it. But in terms of the relative contribution compared to stormwater, compared to agriculture, they're actually quite small. There are other conversations going, and we can all agree to disagree, and that's fine. There are other conversations going on regarding the appropriate extent of regulation of wetlands and farming. I can't really speak to that myself. Well, I think we are at 3:30 on the nose. Any last minute questions?
How much has this project cost to date?
I'm sorry, which project?
Your project here of, I guess this, what you're doing right now, going town to town, you've made the basics, you've decided that this is going to be imposed, the permitting formula has been devised to be imposed upon all of these businesses and so on. To date, what does this project cost?
Cost the state agency to develop these programs? Is that what your question is?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think that cost accounting is important. And you have done a very thorough job with this, but to not have an understanding of what that is costing before it's even imposed, we, the taxpayers of the state of Vermont, are paying for this. So I would suggest in further statements that you put out that you would let us know where our tax dollars are going. Thank you.
Well, I took that as a question. There's a lot of questions I can't answer on the spot. The agency does track all its expenses.
Well, I think if you bounce it up and say there's a real question that needs to be asked of the people who are doing the state's budget, the people who are assigning funds to different projects, there needs to be some kind of connect between the work you're doing in your different departments and what it's actually costing. Because it all seems very much out of control. And as someone who lives on everyone here has to try to live within their means. Businesses are having a hard time staying in Vermont. Would it be easier to just go over and incorporate in New York State, which is business friendly in comparison to Vermont? As an entity that should be competitive for bringing businesses in and jobs for people, and people, keeping the people here who have paid the price of different projects. I think there is a responsibility for everyone working within a field, including all of you, as to how much this costs and what that is in relation to the cost for the state of Vermont. The pockets are not deep here. Thank you.
Hillary Solomon, Fulton Meadowy Conservation District. I did actually just, this is not a public, I guess I have a question. But I did follow the funding bill fairly closely for some of this clean water funding that was passed through the legislature this last legislative session. And there were millions of dollars raised from our existing tax base. There were no new taxes, so I think that's something to sort of be grateful about. And also the bill was, the clean water funding bill was made so that private properties could use tax dollars to implement projects like these. And there also were special sort of funds designated through S96, currently Act 76, so that these properties that were being regulated under this 3-acre rule could also use these funds that were being designated as clean water funds. So there is I guess, some good news as part of the funding that Teresa's talking about.
Do you have a sense of like a clear timeline of when 9050 would actually become official? So if we're developing permit applications, should we be trying to follow that guideline for the coming projects, or looking back and using what's?
Again, the public comment period closes November 8th. I expect we'll get some comments that'll take a little while to chew through, so hopefully we'll have a final permit issued by the end of the year, a final decision, but we have to wait and see about the comments. So best guess would be end of the year, early 2020. In terms of a project going forward today, I mean, you can apply today, under be it an individual permit or under 3-9015. There isn't that much that will change. Obviously, as you get close, you need to know which forms we're filling out. We'll try to give folks as much lead time as we can, and perhaps set an effective date, so folks don't get, crossed up as they're getting close to submitting an application. All right, well, do appreciate it. Thank you for all who helped set up the room here, putting out chairs and so forth.